Okay, let's unpack this. We have a truly fascinating deep dive today, one that bridges history, law, and ethics from two seemingly disparate worlds. We're talking separated by continents and well over 1,000 years. And this isn't just going to be a comparative history lesson. This is really an investigation into the foundational DNA of justice itself.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
We're drawing today from some really powerful research. It's titled Judicial Ethics, From Caliphs to Modern Courts. And it focuses on this enduring and universal theme of justice without fear or favor.
Justice without fear or favor. I like that.
And our mission today really is to understand how principles established centuries ago, the core ethical values practiced by figures like the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the rightly guided caliphs, became effectively the moral and intellectual conscience of modern judicial ethics.
The conscience are
The
good.
very same ethics that we now see codified in constitutions all around the globe.
That is a pretty profound, and I have to say, a slightly provocative statement. The idea that the ethical bedrock we rely on today in our current legal systems might trace its necessary components, its, philosophical rigor, all the way back to 7th century governance. It kind of requires us to look past the conventional narratives of legal history, doesn't it?
It forces you to, yes.
So what we're looking for then is that common thread, that invisible line of ethical necessity connecting, say, dramatic, instantaneous dismissal of a judge or qadi in the early Islamic era with a monumental battle waged by a chief justice against a king in 17th century Britain.
Exactly. They seem like completely different worlds, but the underlying principle is identical. It's the same fight, just with different opponents.
So how does the research help us connect those dots?
Well, the source materials methodology is incredibly insightful because it forces that comparison. It doesn't just present these, historical anecdotes in isolation.
No.
It pairs a specific Islamic judicial precedent with a parallel modern constitutional struggle. And then from that pairing, it extracts the overarching timeless ethical and legal lessons. And this method, it really demands that we look beyond geography, beyond culture, beyond chronology, and instead focus purely on the universal commitment required for judicial integrity to survive.
And to set the stage for this millennia-spanning conversation, we're focusing on two key figures, as you said. They're separated by these vast stretches of time and culture, yet they are united by one unwavering belief: the supremacy and the neutrality of justice.
Mm-hmm.
On one side, we have the second rightly guided Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, or Umar, R.A.
Right.
And just for clarity for our listeners, that R.A. stands for Radi Alhu Anhu, which means may God be pleased with him.
An honorific used for the companions of the Prophet.
Right. And on the other side, we have this towering English legal figure, Chief Justice Edward Coke. One fought internal compromise, the other external coercion.
And that contrast is just fascinating, isn't it?
Mm.
Because it highlights the two fundamental ways that judicial independence can be destroyed. Well, either by corruption from within or by coercion from without. And both of those threats, as we're about to see, were addressed with just uncompromising clarity.
Let's begin where the source material does then. With that ethical foundation laid in the 7th century, and to really understand this revolutionary principle of integrity, you really do have to transport yourself back to Medina. The system of governance under the early caliphate was, it wasn't just rapidly expanding geographically. It was also setting these unprecedented standards for public administration, for bureaucracy, and most critically for this discussion, for judicial purity.
Absolutely. The focus here is so rigorously maintained in the source material. It's not just about ensuring the purity of the written law on a page. It's about guaranteeing the purity of the judge's heart, their internal inclination.
The heart of the judge. That's a much higher bar.
It's an incredibly high bar. The standard set for those serving as qadis, the judges who dispensed justice, was absolute, and that severity was by design. You have to understand, the justice system was viewed as the mechanism through which divine law was implemented on earth. That means it had to be completely, totally impartial.
Any deviation, however small, would be a huge problem.
It would risk invalidating the entire function. Caliph Umar, R.A., he was legendary for his strictness in administration, particularly in ensuring that those who occupied the bench were beyond any form of ethical reproach or compromise. He viewed judicial office not as a position of power or prestige, but as a position of sacred trust.
And the source material we're looking at, it highlights a specific, almost shockingly stringent incident. It involves a qadi being dismissed, and not for ruling incorrectly, not for being a bad judge in that sense, but for a tiny ethical slip. Tell us about this action and the circumstances around it, because this really defines the threshold, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. This incident is a masterclass in what you might call preventive ethics. Caliph Umar, R.A., dismissed a Kivati for accepting what was described as merely a small gift.
A small gift, not a suitcase full of cash.
No, nothing like that. We are talking about something minor, perhaps a practical item or a gesture given after a case was concluded. The research is very clear on this. It emphasizes that this was emphatically not a blatant bribe intended to swing a verdict.
So the case was already over.
The case was over. The judge probably interpreted it as just a gesture of gratitude from a litigant who had, successfully concluded their appearance before the court. In his own mind, he likely rationalized it as harmless etiquette, something like a professional courtesy or maybe a minor thank you note, but in material form.
Okay, this detail is absolutely crucial for you, the listener, to grasp. If it was just a token of appreciation, a simple courtesy, why such an extreme career-ending reaction? I mean, immediate dismissal. It seems so disproportionate unless the ethical threshold Umar was upholding was designed to be, I don't know, impossibly, inhumanly high.
But that's just it. The threshold was designed to be impossibly high, and that was the core feature that made the system resilient. So when the judge protested, and he argued vehemently that the gift had absolutely no impact on his previous decision.
Which he probably believed.
Yeah, probably did. He insisted he remained impartial during the case and that the gift only came afterward. But Umar, R.A., delivered a reply that in many ways just encapsulates the standard for judicial integrity for all time. He wasn't looking at the past case. He was looking at all future cases.
And this brings us to that defining quote. It's one of those quotes that should be memorized by anyone entering public service. What did he say?
When the judge defended his integrity, the Caliph replied with a question that just turned the judge's own argument completely against him. He asked, "Would it not have inclined your heart, even slightly?" And then he delivered the crucial line, "Justice bends by small degrees before it breaks."
Justice bends by small degrees before it breaks. Wow. And that first part, inclined your heart even slightly, is terrifyingly precise, isn't it? It steps outside the simple legal definition of corruption, and it addresses the fundamental psychological vulnerability of the human mind. But let me push back on this a little bit, just to play devil's advocate. Isn't there an argument that Umar's standard was, well, too severe? I mean, does dismissing a judge who might otherwise be highly competent and just simply over a small gesture of courtesy, does that lead to a brittle system rather than a resilient one? You could be removing good people from the bench unnecessarily.
That is a necessary challenge, and it's a fair one. And the source material addresses it by focusing on the purpose of that severity. Umar, R.A., was practicing what we might now call a high form of prophylactic justice.
Prophylactic, so preventative.
A preventative ethic, exactly. He understood that corruption rarely begins with a massive, obvious, easily traceable bribe. It starts with the normalization of favor. It starts with the small, the insidious, the culturally acceptable gesture that shifts one's internal emotional balance.
The little things.
The little things. The Qadi might genuinely believe his future decisions are unaffected, but Umar was addressing a fundamental psychological truth. Gratitude creates a sense of debt, and debt, even an unconscious one, creates inclination.
So the dismissal wasn't fundamentally about punishing a proven specific act of corruption in a past case. It was about protecting the future perception and the future integrity of the entire institution.
That's the key.
Because if the public knows a judge is receiving gifts from past litigants, even small ones, how can any future litigant, especially someone who can't afford to give a gift, ever trust that judge's neutrality?
Precisely. That trust is the currency of the court. The moment the perception is compromised, the authority of the law just evaporates, even if the judge remains technically pure in their rulings. So this one incident, it synthesizes the key principle. No judge may receive favor, gift, or fear. This established a standard of judicial independence that was centered primarily on internal ethical control.
Internal control.
Yes. It asserts that the judge must relentlessly govern their own desires, their own internal emotional responses, and even potential feelings of gratitude. And frankly, that is a far more difficult standard to uphold than merely being free from some kind of external coercion. If your heart is inclined toward one party because of past generosity, even an unconscious inclination, you have already lost the prerequisite for judgment.
Regardless of the ultimate legality of your ruling.
Correct. The internal state is what matters.
This just demands an unparalleled level of self-vigilance.
Yeah.
It's an administrative rule that's backed by a spiritual demand for purity of heart. So this internal independence, this freedom from bias, favor, or gratitude, becomes the ethical bedrock. And it anticipates the great struggles for legal independence that would be fought structurally centuries later in the West.
Absolutely. And just think about the modern parallels for a second.
Right.
Why do we have exhaustive conflict of interest documentation today?
Right.
Why must judges recuse themselves, not just when they are demonstrably biased, but when there's even an appearance of a conflict?
The appearance is enough.
It's because modern legal systems implicitly acknowledge Umar's insight. The public's confidence is everything, and the slightest inclination, if you leave it unchecked, will eventually lead to the system bending and then ultimately breaking. It's a profound lesson in institutional resilience through ethical rigidity.
And the lesson here, it seems, is that integrity has to be absolute. It has to extend even to the most minor gestures of influence. It's a preventative ethic that says we can't wait for the evidence of a broken system. We must safeguard against the slightest bend in the judge's internal moral compass. Okay, so from that microethical challenge, we now need to move to the macro-structural problem of state power, bridging 1,000 years to see how this same universal principle of justice without favor manifested in 17th century Britain.
It's quite a leap in time, but the principle is a perfect match.
So we jump forward. Over 1,000 years, we're crossing from the early Islamic Caliphate to the turbulent political climate of 17th century England. This era is defined by extreme tension between the ancient established traditions of common law and the rising, often volatile doctrine of the divine right of kings.
Embodied by the Stuart monarchy.
Right. And at the center of the storm, we have Chief Justice Edward Coke, a man widely regarded as one of the fiercest champions of the common law tradition. And he finds himself staring down the face of executive power in the form of King James I.
And the contrast here is just so stark. Caliph Umar's judge faced a self-made ethical crisis, a crisis of conscience and personal discipline. Coke faced a full-blown constitutional crisis engineered by the sovereign himself.
So what was the king's position? What did he believe?
King James fundamentally believes he derived his authority directly from God. Therefore, in his mind, he was the living source of all law. It flowed from him. For him, the judges were merely his delegates, his servants, doing his bidding, and they could be dismissed or overruled at his pleasure if they ever deviated from the royal will.
So if Umar's concern was a judge being inclined by a small private favor, Coke's concern was a judge being coerced by the supreme power of the state itself. Coke knew that if the king could personally intervene in judicial affairs, then the judiciary just ceases to be an independent branch of government. It becomes a tool.
It becomes a tool of the executive. Precisely. The king desired to rule personally. He specifically tried to involve himself in judicial proceedings and demanded that the judges, including Coke, submit to the royal will. He was demanding they acknowledge that the king had the inherent power to override, to interpret, or to personally decide legal cases. He was essentially telling the judicial branch, you work for me.
The source material we're looking at anchors this massive constitutional conflict around a specific and famous historical moment, the case of Prohibition's del Roy from 1607. To really understand the gravity of Coke's stand, we need to know what exactly this case was about. It wasn't just the king demanding obedience in the abstract, was it?
No, it was very concrete. The case of Prohibition's del Roy concerned jurisdiction. Who gets to decide what? The king was asserting that he, sitting in his royal courts like the Court of High Commission, had the right to decide cases which properly belonged to the common law courts, specifically matters that touch upon the life, the inheritance, or the property of his subjects.
The most fundamental things.
The most fundamental things. And Coke and the other common law judges argued that the interpretation and application of the common law required technical expertise. It required specialized training. He called it a certain art known only to the judges and not to the king.
I can imagine the king didn't take that well.
He took deep personal offense. He basically said, if I am the fount of all justice, why can I not administer it myself?
And that really puts the confrontation in context. It wasn't just some abstract theory. This was a physical showdown over who held the power to interpret the law that governed citizens' lives and their property. It was a direct demand for the executive branch to just subsume the judicial branch entirely.
Yes. And Coke's refusal, his defiance, it required not just a brilliant intellectual argument, but immense personal bravery. He knew he was risking his position. He was risking his freedom and potentially his life by challenging the king's assertion of divine absolute power. This is the moment when Edward Coke transforms from just a great lawyer into a true constitutional hero.
And his reply in that moment became one of the foundational statements of modern constitutionalism, a principle that is now enshrined in documents all over the world. What was that fearless reply he gave directly to King James I?
Coke stood firm. He absolutely refused to yield the principle of common law jurisdiction to the monarch's prerogative. He famously quoted an ancient legal text, Bracton, and asserted, "The king himself ought not to be under man, but under God and under the law."
Under God and under the law, not above it.
Not above it.
That declaration fundamentally redefined the political landscape of England and eventually the entire structure of liberal democracy. By stating that the king is under the law, sub deo alleged Coke established the principle that judges owe their allegiance not to the person occupying the throne, but to the legal framework itself.
It was the first powerful, sustained defense of what we would now call judicial review and the separation of powers in the Western tradition.
So this action, then, defines the modern principle that no power, not even the crown, is above law. This is the establishment of external judicial independence, the freedom of the judiciary from political interference or executive control.
And this institutional safeguard is the perfect legal mirror to the ethical safeguard that Umar demanded 1,000 years earlier.
That comparison brings us right back to our core mission. If Caliph Umar mandated independence from internal inclination, from subtle bias, the quiet enemy within the judge, then Chief Justice Coke mandated independence from the external coercive power of the state, the loud enemy on the throne.
They both protect the sanctity of the bench, just through different fortifications. They're two sides of the same essential requirement for justice.
So a legal system needs both.
It absolutely needs both. If you have a judge who is free from the king's influence, which is Coke's achievement, but that same judge is beholden to a gift or a favor Umar's great fear, then the system is still compromised. It's still corruptible.
And the other way around.
Conversely, if you have a judge who is ethically pure, the ideal that Umar was striving for, but that judge is constantly overruled or dismissed or intimidated by the executive, which was Coke's reality, then the purity of the judge is irrelevant. It doesn't matter how pure they are, if the rule of law cannot actually be enforced.
This realization is where the source material we're looking at truly shines. It's recognizing that the fight for justice without fear or favor has to address the whole spectrum of threats, from the micro-psychological to the macro-constitutional. Coke built the external wall of separation. Umar set the internal sentinel to guard the judge's heart.
And this structural defense by Coke, it ultimately led to landmark constitutional changes in England. Changes that explicitly focused on preventing the crown from exercising the very powers that James I claimed. The subsequent struggles in England were all about institutionalizing the separation so that no future monarch or executive could repeat the kind of coercion that Coke faced.
But I just want to pause on Coke's bravery for a moment. You really have to stop and reflect on the absolute personal cost here. This wasn't just an academic legal debate in a quiet room. He was staring down the divine right of monarchy. King James I was, by all accounts, incandescent with rage after this confrontation. What was the direct personal consequence for Coke?
The consequence was severe, and it was swift. The king couldn't immediately dismantle the entire common law system, but he could certainly dismantle the judge. Coke was eventually dismissed from his post as Chief Justice of the King's Bench in 1616. James I tried to strip him of his authority and silence him.
So he lost his job for it.
He did. However, his dismissal only solidified his reputation as a martyr for the common law. The fight didn't end there. Coke went on to become a leader in Parliament, and he was instrumental in pushing through crucial measures like the Petition of Right in 1628, continuing his legal crusade to limit royal prerogative. So in a way, his dismissal ultimately served to galvanize the very movement for parliamentary and judicial independence he championed.
So he lost his job, but the rule of law won a foundational principle. Which brings us to the synthesis of all this. How do these two seemingly disparate stories, a dismissal over a small gift and a dismissal for defying a king, share the same essential ratio decidendi, the same core legal reasoning?
The ratio decidendi, or the underlying rationale and common ethical thread that binds these two extraordinary historical events, is stated simply in the research, but it's incredibly profound. It's this: a judge's purity of heart is as vital as the purity of law. Both must remain unswayed by power. It's a comprehensive, a holistic view of integrity, recognizing that the battle is fought equally in the structure of the courtroom and within the private conscience of the judge.
And the genius of this comparative analysis, as the source material presents it, is that it provides a crucial historical impact statement. And it really reframes legal history for us, the learner. We often place the birth of institutional judicial independence squarely in 17th century Europe, rooted in thinkers like Locke and actions like Coke's. But the research we're drawing on claims otherwise.
It does. It highlights that this connection shows how Islamic governance introduced and institutionally practiced judicial independence centuries before it was formally recognized, defined, and fought for in Europe.
That's a huge claim.
It is. While Koch's actions provided the legal structure for external independence in the common law tradition, Umar's actions demonstrated the rigorous ethical standard and the necessary institutional implementation. The absolute need for a judiciary to function free from personal influence, whether that influence is royal or financial. The key difference is the timeline and the emphasis. For Umar, ethical purity was the starting point.
This reframing is incredibly significant. It tells us that these institutional safeguards against power weren't a uniquely Western invention that suddenly appeared during the Enlightenment. They were central to the stable functioning of sophisticated legal systems centuries earlier. The principle of judicial freedom from influence profoundly predates its formal constitutional expression in Europe.
And because this principle speaks to a universal human need for reliable, trustworthy justice, it never died. It's a universal legal truth that has now been codified globally. You see it in common law nations, civil law nations, developing democracies. We can see how this ideal persists in modern legal frameworks all over the world, explicitly structured to prevent the very compromises that Umar and Koch faced.
Okay, let's examine those modern echoes, because this is where the historical insights translate directly into present-day law. The source material points to several specific constitutional articles that echo this core ideal of judicial separation and independence. Let's start with the one that deals most explicitly with Koch's victory over the safeguards in the U.S. Constitution.
Absolutely. The U.S. Constitution, in Article 3, establishes the judicial branch, and this article is a structural safeguard that is built directly upon the failures of the British monarchy that Koch fought against. It grants federal judges two main protections: lifetime tenure during good behavior, and the crucial provision that their compensation cannot be diminished while they are in office. And these aren't just abstract concepts. They are specific institutional answers to the challenges faced by Koch.
How so? Can you break that down? How does fixed salary and tenure specifically solve the problem that King James posed?
Well, they directly addressed executive coercion. Think about it. If King James I wanted to dismiss Koch for ruling against him, you could just fire him. He did fire him. Lifetime tenure says the executive cannot fire a judge simply for disagreeing with policy or ruling against the state. The only way to remove them is through the extremely difficult political process of impeachment for actual misconduct.
Which is very rare.
Very rare. And that protection gives the judge the courage to rule against a president or a Congress without fearing professional ruin. Similarly, King James threatened to reduce a judge's salary or deny them a raise, basically financially starving them into compliance. The fixed salary clause prevents the executive or the legislature from using the power of the purse to influence judicial decisions. These two mechanisms, tenure and salary protection, are the institutional embodiment of Koch's declaration that the judge serves the law, not the man.
That is the external wall of protection, Koch's legacy, perfectly enshrined in law. Now let's look at two other crucial examples from the Global South that the research highlights, which deal more closely with ensuring that separation of powers. You mentioned India and Pakistan.
Yes. In India, Article 50 of the Constitution is a foundational directive principle of state policy. It states that the state shall take steps to separate the judiciary from the executive in the public services of the state. This isn't just a suggestion, it's a foundational directive. It means the entire administrative structure of the judiciary must be autonomous from the agencies of the executive, the police, the tax authorities, you name it.
And in Pakistan, the constitutional mandate is even more explicit, isn't it? Echoing that need for structural separation championed by Koch.
It is. In Pakistan, Article 175 specifically deals with the establishment and jurisdiction of courts, and it explicitly mandates the separation of the judiciary from the executive. This isn't merely about judicial review, it's about institutional integrity and autonomy. It's about ensuring that the courts operate independently of the political administration of the day. All of these clauses, U.S. Article 3, India Article 50, Pakistan Article 175, they're all constitutional mechanisms built to formalize this historical struggle against executive pressure.
But what's so fascinating as we connect all this is that while the language is constitutional and the context is modern, the ultimate goal returns to Umar's original ethical demand. The judge must be free from pressure or favor. Whether the threat is a small gift designed to incline the heart, or a king trying to command a verdict, or a modern executive threatening to withhold funding. The judicial function just collapses if that foundational freedom is compromised.
It really demonstrates the profound and timeless moral imperative that unites human governance across millennia. The moral derived from this comparative analysis is clear, and it's also a bit chilling. Justice begins to die the day judges start to please the powerful. And it doesn't matter if that pleasure is sought through political favor or personal gratitude.
Therefore, integrity isn't merely a nice-to-have virtue for a judge. It's the absolute non-negotiable lifeline of the law. If integrity goes, the rule of law goes with it. The entire system is built on the public's faith that the individual seated on the bench is unswayed by either the power of the state or the kindness of a litigant.
And when you realize that one of the earliest recorded institutional standards involved dismissing a judge over a small gift, you understand the severity of the threat. It was about preventing that gradual, insidious rot that comes from normalized favors and unconscious bias. The principle is simple. The judge must remain pure so that the law can remain pure in its application.
So, to summarize our journey today, we've seen two judges, separated by continents, by faiths, by a millennium, and yet they both confirm this universal truth. Justice cannot survive under pressure, influence, or favor. Umar addressed the microethical environment, ensuring the judge's conscience was clean of inclination. Koch addressed the macro-legal environment, ensuring the judge's institution was safe from the sovereign. And modern constitutions are simply the legal codification of both of their victories.
And by synthesizing these two stories, the source material we've been discussing really compels us to appreciate the depth and the historical breadth of this concept of judicial independence. It's an ideal that has been fought for and codified from Medina in the 7th century through London in the 17th, right up to the Supreme Courts of the 21st century. The vigilance required is perpetual.
This has been a truly remarkable deep dive. It shows us that the core challenge of justice has remained fundamentally unchanged since the foundation of institutional governance. We've explored Caliph Umar, RA, setting an almost impossible ethical standard against subtle internal influence, insisting that even the appearance of inclination destroys trust. And we followed Chief Justice Koch defining a monumental legal standard against state power, ensuring judges are under law, not under man.
And we owe this insightful synthesis, this reframing of legal history, to the expertise of the source author, Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir. He's acknowledged as a constitutional corporate lawyer and a prolific author, and he's done this incredible job of connecting these essential ethical arcs across civilizations.
It really makes you wonder, though, if the fight has always been against pressure and favor, how do we spot the modern equivalents? We've discussed these overt pressures kings and literal bribes. But today's threats are often so much more nuanced, more systemic.
And that raises the most important question, I think, especially for you, the listener, who is now armed with this historical context. We've discussed the historical extremes, but if we take Umar's principle seriously, that justice bends by small degrees before it breaks, what vigilance is required of us as citizens when those small degrees of bending occur today? We rarely see a king demand a verdict in the chambers now. Instead, what are the subtle, systemic internal pressures facing judges today? Pressures that are not strictly monetary or executive, but perhaps related to career advancement pathways or political confirmation processes or cultural norms or even information bias, particularly in these highly charged media-saturated cases.
That's a great point. For instance, a small gift today might be equivalent to constant favorable coverage from a powerful media outlet, or the promise of a lucrative post-retirement role on a corporate board, or just the subtle social pressure that's applied through highly politicized judicial appointments. None of these are bribes in the legal sense, but they can certainly incline a judge's heart, even slightly, toward one perspective over another.
Exactly. The ultimate ethical challenge is always to maintain the pure heart in a powerful position. The battle for the rule of law is fought not just in the high courts, but in the internal fortitude of every single judge to say no to every form of favor, no matter how small, and to say no to every form of fear, no matter how powerful the source. If integrity is the lifeline of the law, the battle for its purity continues, often in the quietest, most nuanced corners of the system, demanding that citizens and the judiciary remain eternally vigilant.
A profound point to reflect on. The challenge of maintaining a pure heart in a powerful position is truly timeless. We encourage you to reflect on the depth of the sources we've reviewed today and what institutional independence really means in your corner of the world.
Until the next deep dive, keep questioning the powerful and keep appreciating the power of the law.